I'd like to welcome everyone to the Women in Public Policy Program seminar. I'm Victoria Budson, Executive Director, and I'm so pleased that we have Judge Nancy Gertner joining us today. As many of you know, our work here at the Women in Public Policy Program focuses on closing gender gaps, and we do so in 4 particular areas. We look at political participation, economic opportunity, education, and health. Judge Gertner is someone who could speak on any of these issues. We're so pleased to have her back at Harvard University. She has again joined the faculty of Harvard Law School. She's here as a professor of practice. In 1994, she was appointed by President Clinton to the U.S. District Court of Massachusetts and served as a judge for 17 years. She has been esteemed prior to being a judge as a lawyer, and I'm going to read her awards because they are too numerous and specific not to. In 2008, she became the second woman after Ruth Bader Ginsburg to receive the Thurgood Marshall Award from the American Bar Association for both her career as a lawyer and a judge. She also became a Leadership Council member of the International Center for Research on Women. And in 2010, she received the Morton A. Brody Distinguished Judicial Service Award, and in 2011 received the Massachusetts Bar Association Hennessy Award for Judicial Excellence. Last April, she published her autobiography. If you haven't read it yet, it is both educational, but God, a page turner, really interesting. It's In Defense of Women, Memoirs of an Unrepentant Advocate. You can pick it up right at our Harvard Coop or at Amazon.com if you don't leave your computer. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Nancy's talk today, where she's going to talk with us about the second wave of feminism and is the cup half empty or half full? So without further ado, I turn it over to you. And now that you're here on campus, oh yeah, you do. Which reminds me, I should say, as always, you'll be able to hear our talk after. If you want to pass it on to your friends, it'll be on the Harvard YouTube channel.
Okay. I'm not sure where I'm going to stand, but I'll start here and then I'll walk around. Go back to Harvard is really a euphemism. In truth, I started at the other place.
Yes, and she has been teaching at Yale since 1990.
I know, it's extraordinary. It seems like it doesn't exist. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be here. I want to frame what I'm talking about in this way. On the one hand, the women of my generation have stories that this book really reflects about what it was like in the 70s and the 80s. And then the question is, why should we talk about those stories? What relevance do they have today? And then I want to talk about the relevance that they have today, which is part of my is the glass half full or half empty theme. So my career as a law student, maybe I should, you don't have to scrunch around, I'll come over here. My career as a lawyer was framed, I graduated Yale Law School. It was at the time when the women's movement and the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement were roaring at Yale Law School. But the best way to describe what it was like, and I love to tell, I'm an old trial lawyer, so I love to do this in terms of stories. I am going to Chicago to interview for a judge, a clerkship rather. The judge is an elderly judge whose name is Luther Swigert, and he's a wonderful man. But when I go to interview him, to be interviewed by him rather, he looks at my record and then he says to me, Ms. Gertner, are you going to marry and have children? I was, in my early 20s. And at that point, I was a mega feminist. I was a mega feminist. No one could say anything that was off in my presence. I was hopelessly feminist. And so I didn't know what to do. I had several alternatives. One thing which crossed my mind was to kick him in some inappropriate place. Say something inappropriate, walk out. And then I decided, which really became a metaphor for the way I maneuvered through these kinds of situations. I said to him, and it was true at the time, no, Judge Swigert, I have no plans to marry and have children, which was true at the time. And actually it was true for most of my 20s and indeed even into my 30s. So now you fast forward 20 years later, And I am in my late 30s, actually, at that point. And Swigert is, there's a retirement party in his honor. And we had become very close, and he asked me to speak on his behalf. And I brought the man that I was then living with. And I went in front of all of the clerks, and they say to me, and I said to him, rather, I said to the clerks, the assembled group, I said, 20 years ago, Judge Swigert asked me if I would marry and have or have children. And I swore to him that I would not. Then I turned to the judge, I got on my knees, and I said, Judge Swigert, I'm 39, barren, release me from the pledge. Now, of course, by that point, he had changed. There had been many women in his chambers. 2 were, at that point, nursing in his library. So he had really changed. And it was sort of an object lesson in the way that things had changed. I should add then, I immediately after that discussion had children. I like to describe my experience with having children as menopause and birth being neck and neck. Happily, birth came first, but it was an open question for a period of time. But the stories never stopped particularly, and that's part of what I want to frame here. And so there is even a wonderful story that I like to tell about when I was a judge, right? And you're in a chambers, a room that, an office that was so quintessentially judge-like and boring, right? Massive desk and all sorts of writings on the wall from my diplomas and my certificate from the president and all this kind of stuff. It couldn't be more judge-like. A woman comes in who's cleaning the offices. And she comes to me and she said, would you mind putting these plastic bags over my hand? And I help her put the plastic bags on my hand. And she said, it's a little awkward. She says, what do you use to clean the toilets? And I thought to myself, there was not a male judge in the building who got that question. Not a male judge at all. And I explained to her what I used to clean the toilets. But it was framing, here I was a judge person and still getting that. So in between the Swigert story and the becoming a judge is this book. And this book really only tells the story of from the time that I was graduated Yale Law School to the time I was sworn in as a judge. There will be a judge book next, but I needed to leave the bench to write it. I could not write what I wanted to write about that until I left the bench. But let me, again, frame the judge book from the memoir. So this book begins with a panel discussion at Yale Law School. And the panel discussion is about young women asking me and the other panelists, how does one become a judge? What's the trajectory? What are the cases you should take? What are the jobs you should have? What are the courses you should take? And we were taking it very seriously. The other panelist was Justice Sotomayor. Only she was then a judge of the Second Circuit and not a justice. She goes first. And she says, how does one become a judge? You go to this fine institution. You do well. You clerk for a judge, or you work in the government. You then work for a private firm. You have opinions you care about deeply, but you're cautious about expressing them, and you become a judge. Then it was my turn. I say, how does one become a judge? Well, you graduate this wonderful institution, no question about it. You clerk for a judge. Then you represent the first lesbian, feminist, radical revolutionary accused of killing a police officer you could find. That would be your first case on prime time. You take every abortion case in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You give speeches on Boston Common. Even you threaten to burn your bar card at one point over some decision. You represent high-profile people. And for the final coup de grace, you marry the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. And you become a judge. So there's the story, and I'm sure you've heard them all before, and it's, in one sense, it's an unfair story about the the women who've made it, notwithstanding all the impediments. Now, that's an important story to tell because young women have to hear the story of the impediments. Because the information that we were dealing with, the kinds of impediments that we had, it's only been one generation. And things don't change. Attitudes simply don't change that quickly. So you have to know what those attitudes are, and particularly for young lawyers, you have to know that the judges you're appearing before came from that history. So you have to know that this, this is, the attitudinal changes are to some degree only skin deep. So in the 1970s when I started, we thought that numbers would do everything. We thought that once the numbers became 50-50, once there would be equal numbers of women in law schools, in corporations, that leadership positions would follow. We were dramatically wrong. Dramatically wrong. And I talk about law firms only because law school is the paradigm of the problem, right? All of a sudden, by around the early 80s, the pipeline for young lawyers became fully equal. 50%, the law schools were producing 50% women, 50% men. The big firms were hiring 50% women and 50% men. And advancement has stalled. And it's terribly important to figure out why, because if it happened there, then you have to worry about everywhere. If it happened there, where there is to some degree an objective measure of a lawyer's performance, it's not necessarily the deals that you finish, or even it's the work product. It's a more objective measure. And if it's stalling in law schools, then we're in trouble. So Judith Kay talks about it in terms of the leaky pipeline. 20 years after women began graduating from law school in equal numbers from men, women still are not even close to 50% of partners. And she says attrition threatens even the meager gains attained. Women in law schools have increased dramatically, graduating equal men and women. Law firms hire equal members of men and women, but percentages are dramatically skewed thereafter. The ranks of partners, equity partners, managing partners, and leadership in the firms, which means leadership in the profession. What she describes as in 1988, 8% of the partners in big firms were women, although the entry-level class was 50%. In 2007, it had gone up to 16% of equity partners, those with a financial stake in the firm, 26% of non-equity, and 30% of counsel. By the way, universities have the same kind of situation, which is who are the full professors, who are the assistants, who are the associates, and then there are always weird categories into which women fit. Neither tenure, neither fish nor fowl, neither tenured nor non-tenured. The number of women promoted to partner increased in the late 80s and early 90s, then leveled off at 15%. And that's where, and it's now that or lower in most of the country. What's worse about this is that there is no outcry. And so I wrote it in 2004, I wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe, which I'm having great fun doing now. You see, now I can speak. It's really quite remarkable. I have nothing, there's really no impediment, except maybe defamation, right? I don't have any impediment to speaking. So in 2007, I was called by the women at Yale Law School. They were very excited. They had a list of the top 10 family-friendly firms for Working Mother magazine. The firms included several Boston firms, and they wanted to show me that they were they were doing something to value the firms that had done good for putting women, as far as working mothers, who had done well for working mothers. And I investigated. I'm a complete workaholic. Total, I can investigate anything at any hour of the day or night. My law clerks would invariably get emails from me at 2 in the morning. One law clerk tells me that I sent him a text message when he was proposing to his wife. I don't remember that. So I investigated. Who are the firms that you counted as family friendly? What does this mean? Several of the Boston firms had equity partners ranging from 10% to 15%. And they were in a section of the article called Honors. And so I wrote the op-ed that I wrote was called the Revolution of Declining Expectations. The notion that we were crediting this suggested that we were really happily now with crumbs, not the kind of crumbs that I thought we had been talking about. That led me to give a speech at the Women's Bar Association. They truck out women judges. And you're supposed to get up there and say, things are fabulous. I'm here, right? There are 3 women on the Boston bench, 3 women on the Supreme Court, right? 50% of the law schools have been women for the past 20 years. 3 women on the Supreme Court, and we're supposed to be really thrilled and delighted about it. So I gave a speech. And right before the Women's Bar Association speech, a week before, was the classic article that you invariably see about why there are no women at the top, because they don't choose to. Periodically, there are articles, and the articles that are suggesting that women are the architect of their own future, and if they're not in positions of power, it's because of something intrinsic to womanness, is the implication. Now, that actually, there are some reasons to talk about women being the architect of their own situation, but it's not anything intrinsic. It's something societal. So the talk that I gave is I said that the myth that the women's movement was about choice was all wrong. That there was somehow, what we were struggling was to enable people to choose to be at home or choose to be at work. And I said, that's not the women's movement that I was a part of. The women's movement that I was a part of was about revolutionizing work and revolutionizing home. At first glance, it seems wonderful to be home with one's children, and I understood that pull, but it's more complicated. The women in the article were not talking about pure voluntary choice. They were talking about social expectations on the one hand and an unfriendly workplace on the other. This was not a choice as between equal alternatives. This was about a choice that was foreordained. They left law firms or they left corporate cultures because they didn't feel welcome, because they didn't know how to combine a family and a career, because they were kept out of the channels of power. They were kept out of the social circles that men of power were part of. And then there were the social expectations that if someone was going to stay home, it was going to be the woman. So they left because the workplace had not been transformed, had not been revolutionized, and because the family had not been transformed. It was more than, I said at the time, the idyllic pull of motherhood on the one hand. It was the push of real obstacles in the workplace on the other. And in fact, Professor Joan Williams, who writes at the Center for Work Life at the University of California at Hastings, talks about the maternal wall. It's almost as if today we no longer should be talking about discrimination, the paradigm of discrimination. I apply for a job, my judge says to me, women are, women have to sort of meet additional expectations to get the job. It is discrimination against women insofar as they are mothers. And that's a whole other issue. So I talked about this is an imperfectly transformed world. It's not about choice. Choice was part of it. When I started, I was coming up against all sorts of attitudes about how women shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that. Women shouldn't be trial lawyers. All sorts of attitudes about no one with my voice and my stature could possibly be successful. And that's mostly what I write about, because it got to be fun after a while, because when I got to know what I was doing, I loved being underestimated. And most of the stories are wonderful stories about being profoundly underestimated and winning. That began to change at some point when I was no longer underestimated, but it still was a great deal of fun. So it was about choice. It was in part about choice. There were certainly professions that seemed inappropriate for women, but it was really more than choice. It was revolutionizing the workplace, revolutionizing home. As a result of that, MIT did a study to find out what the situation was with women in the law firms, why women were leaving, and to sort of see if we were right in our conclusions that it was the maternal wall to a large extent. And that study, which was published, found that 30% of the women who enter law firms leave, while only 20% of the men do. And the women who leave, some leave to go to other legal jobs, but a very high percentage go home. There's no comparable percentage of the men. Even the women who became equity partners, the top of the heap, 15% leave. And then there was a catalyst study of women law students that was done by, that was sponsored by Columbia, Harvard, University of Michigan, and Yale, University of California, that really mirrored the same kind of thing. As I said, it's a paradigm of the problem, because we were at 50%. So you know what the universe of the entry level is. And in the catalyst study, it was the same thing. They concluded, looking at their graduates, that men and women agreed that the top barrier to women's advancement is personal and family responsibilities. Almost 70% of the women regarded this as the most significant issue. 50% of the men regarded it as the most significant issue. And the statistics that they found about why women leave and the circumstances under which they leave really mirrored the same statistics that we had found. 34%, even though firms may have part-time jobs and a different kind of track if you want to deal with family responsibilities, in their study, 34% of women law graduates have worked part-time. Only 9% of the men have. Unless we transform family responsibilities, making this available is not going to make a difference. And women left because of the parental issues, and men did not. What do we do about this? What should we do about this? And complaining, it used to be, 20 years ago, it was enough to sort of announce the problem, and you thought that things would follow. It was a question of making people aware of the problem, and then all that you wanted would follow. We've hit a wall. Sheryl Sandberg, who does wonderful, interesting stuff, interesting speeches she's the CEO of Facebook, gave a speech which was, I found, incredibly moving about leaning in and leaning out, which is to say that young women lean out of the workplace immediately, anticipating issues when they have children. In other words, they choose a career path that will enable them to have children. And I saw that. I spoke in Golden Gate Law School and with a group around the table, and one woman said, I think I'm going to go into a small firm and do family law. And I said, why? Are you interested in family law? She said, not at all. Are you interested in small firm work? She said, not at all. She said, but I plan to have a family, and this is the only way to combine it. Now, that's very interesting and very troubling. So I'm a lawyer. I come from I was someone who did discrimination cases. If women are leaning out, then their failure to advance can't be the subject of a lawsuit. They are, in other words, the lawsuit, the discrimination paradigm is someone external to you, prejudged you, either because you're a woman or because you're a mother or because of your social responsibilities. If women are doing it earlier to themselves, if they're leaning out, there is no case to be made. If women are anticipating problems later on and therefore leaning out, then there's no case to be made. And the only way to deal with that is in terms of changing attitudes. Let me just finish, okay? The discrimination laws, in any event, are not successful any longer. One of my op-eds, on my long list of op-eds, I feel like having a section of the paper that will go, she's back. But I want to say that I think that to all intents and purposes, Title VII, the employment discrimination law, has been reversed, has been thrown out. If I told you the cases that lose in federal court, you would be astonished. My favorite case is one out of the Seventh Circuit. There was a woman who was a lineman for an electric company, the only female lineman. She alleged hostile environment, sexual harassment so bad that it included, quote, a co-worker's deliberately urinating on the floor near where she was working, shoving, pushing, hitting her, sexually offensive touching, exposing her to pornographic magazines. She loses. How could she possibly lose, you might ask? It's a question I ask myself. Well, because discrimination law, rather than looking at things contextually, rather than looking at the whole, rather than putting all the pieces in the pot that comprise discrimination, as one scholar described it, slices and dices, takes the phenomenon and holds it up in a completely unrealistic way. And in this case, the court said, well, there were these instances of looking at pornographic activities. Okay. And there was the pushing and shoving. Well, those occurred outside of the statute of limitations. In other words, those occurred too long ago to be able to be dealt with in this case. You don't look at them as a course of conduct ending with peeing next to you. You look at it as a separate event. Those specific 5 or 6 events were outside of the statute of limitations. And as far as peeing on the floor, you would imagine that would really be a big one. There was a problem with that. The problem was that there were no facilities for women or men, no bathroom facilities for women or men. So the peeing on the floor was what he described it as disparate impact, not disparate treatment. Disparate treatment is I treat you differently because you're a woman. Disparate impact is a neutral rule whose net effect is to discriminate against women. You don't have bathrooms. She's the only one who, the men can go outside and take a whiz in the yard. She can't. That's not the way women are. So the failure to have any facilities redounds to her detriment. Neutral rule has disparate impact on women. But he said she hadn't alleged that. She hadn't specifically alleged disparate impact. Slicing and dicing. Not you read this and you say, a course of conduct of discrimination from before the statute of limitation, culminating in peeing next to me. In fact, there was a wonderful dissent, a stinging dissent from a woman judge on the panel. Another discussion about the importance of having women in these positions. I felt like when I read this dissent, it should be like your old-fashioned, when you broke up with a guy or whoever, you burned the edges of the letter. This was a dissent that in the law book should have had burnt edges around it. She says, she began her opinion with a personal story about bathroom facilities for women judges in her own court, and wrote that women know that this disparity, which strikes many men to be secondary, if not trivial, can affect their ability to function. And then she looked at the evidence presented at trial within the framework of a hostile environment. She criticized the majority's technical and formalistic distinction on the ground, as she put it, quote, discrimination in the real world does not fit neatly into the legal models we have constructed. And we have. One of the things I'm writing about is that the majority of discrimination cases fail in the federal courts. The majority fail. And indeed, when I was a baby judge, that's what they called new judges, there was a trainer from the previous administration who was training us. And he got up and he said, let me show you how to get rid of these cases. Let me show you how to get rid of these cases. So, and I might add that the Walmart case is the coup de grace in a way. Walmart suggests that the only meaningful discrimination cases that you can bring are those in which the discrimination is overt. Women leaning out, the failure to really deal with family-friendly issues are not overt discrimination. And if the model is the only discrimination that we will regard as actionable is when the boss says, I hate women. You are not getting this job because that's the only one. Then they're dealing with a world that no longer existed, if it ever did, a world that is much more subtle. In fact, the irony is that Harvard, Mazarin Banerjee is doing wonderful work on implicit bias. So the irony here is that social psychologists are talking about implicit bias just as the courts are searching for explicit bias. So my framework, my stage, the court, is not where the action is. That's not where we're going to deal with implicit bias and the maternal wall. In one sense, the only thing is the market, is collective action, is taking account of the statistics, is re-educating both judges and the public as to what the real patterns are, is answering every stupid article like the article that appeared in the New York Times that I described. We can't prove discrimination by the sign on the door anymore. So the only way to address it is by the statistics, by the institutional structures, the absence of meaningful daycare and what that means in law firms. It may not be an issue of going to court. It may be an issue of legislation. It may be an issue of education. You can't expect individual women to do it, because the other thing that I've seen in my travels talking to young women is what they, it's a wonderful term, and women around the table I think would identify with this. For young women, it's the opacity of discrimination. Discrimination is opaque. In one sense, my book, it was easier for me. You know, when I got turned down for a job, I knew precisely why. When you get turned down for a job, you walk away and you say, gee, I'm not good enough. I'm not. And so until we begin to say, the last 5 people that applied for this job, the last 5 women are not good enough, something is wrong. Unless we begin to, we have to dig into the weeds of this in a way that we haven't been doing because it's seen as individual. And then I have a really, revolutionary suggestion, which is so out of keeping with the way we are today. I continue to believe that the government needs to step up to the plate, that there ought to be subsidized daycare, that there ought to be programs that where the government does what essentially the market has not done, that if you mean to make full advantage of the women in your midst, that's the way that you can do it. And once the government begins to create incentives for daycare, et cetera, then it will happen. But I am, I can't even begin to imagine that coming out of the mouths of any of the current presidential candidates. So there is there's an educational issue. Ben Heinemann, who was formerly the general counsel of GE, does wonderful work on this, talks about insisting to corporate executives that the talent pool of women lawyers is broad and deep, that there's a business case for gender equality beyond the obvious need to tap a rich vein of talent, that we're at a time when women are at critical roles in all levels of society. Law firms have to recognize that they have to meet that need. Diversity inside firms and corporations add to the texture and the richness of the dialogue about how we should discharge our professional obligations. The dissent of Justice Rovner is a classic example. She had understandings of the context that a male judge would not necessarily have. So in one sense, it's a propitious time. The numbers, I wasn't able to get the numbers, the law firm numbers now, but I suspect that the layoffs are worse for women and the attrition rate is worse for women in this economy, and the ability to get back in is worse for women in this economy. But at the same time, the economic crisis has first forced law firms to rethink their models. The 24/7 clock, which I function on, but which law firms also function on, actually is incredibly disadvantageous to anyone who wishes to have a life. We've made it possible now for there to be no boundaries between work and home. And if women continue to have principal responsibilities for child caring, it will invariably redound to their detriment. So the maternal wall, implicit bias, the opacity of discrimination. We have to collect the data. We have to engage in collective action again. We have to challenge the government. And in the final analysis, the most important thing is we have to be unsatisfied. We have to not believe that this was the accomplishment of the women's movement, that I'm here and that you're here was somehow all that we can achieve. I don't know about you, but I aim much, much higher. Thank you. You had a question.
Well, I had a comment more, and you did address a part of it because I think it is probably for legislation at this point. And you have spoken about having, I think that daycare is extremely important. But what you haven't mentioned that I think is even more important is parental leave. Because parental leave is what gives the father or, I don't know, the father type, the male partner, the possibility of truly bonding with his child, and truly becoming a parent, which I think a lot of doesn't happen in this society. And the Scandinavian countries are doing it, so it's not a question of reinventing the wheel, it's a question of studying what they're doing, have them come and tell us what they're doing and seeing what is realistic to try to implement.
Parental leave that is mandated by legislation.
Yes, and it has to be equal for men and women.
Right. The advantage of the government doing this, I'm always hesitant in talking about this. The advantage of the government doing it is the government then legitimizes it in a way that GE and this law firm doesn't. The government legitimizes. The problem though with parental leave is that even in the Scandinavian countries, men still don't take it to the same degree as women, but certainly more than men here do. There's no question, by the way, that young male students who come to my office, male law students, also talk about wanting a family-friendly environment. There's no question that there's more men who are concerned about that, but the prototype, the difference in reaction is palpable. The man that leaves at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to go to the soccer game is seen as a fabulous dad. The woman who leaves at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is seen as not committed to her job. And until we change that, we're not going to change this. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You just destroyed all my European illusions on the American culture of rights. But I have a concrete case to submit to you. You said that the anti-discrimination law was not good for women. So young women pregnant apply to an institute for advanced study, which is where important feminists are in charge. She gets in and she says, well, I'm pregnant, can I postpone my stay? No, that's not possible. You have to apply once again. I must say that I considered suing, but I'm not American, so I didn't have the courage to do that. And
we'll talk afterwards. I can now go back and
out, but I think that was probably the best solution to adopt because there is no way in court, as you seem to suggest.
So you had your child and you
Oh yeah, the child. I kept the child.
You kept the child. Yeah, you kept the child, not the job. Let me think about that. No, okay. If there was a policy that no one could ever be deferred, you would have a problem. If they had a policy that deferred depending upon the circumstances, and women's circumstances didn't count, then you would have a lawsuit. But the other problem with lawsuits is tremendous. I mean, I write about this, I loved going into court. I loved representing women. But as I got towards right before I became a judge, I began to worry. First of all, the cost and the consequences are enormous.
I know.
Enormous, right. So the other, I want to think concretely about it, how to do this. We used to have public interest firms that would support women, provide resources to bring these cases if they were important cases, and we should be doing that again. Because particularly since the law has focused both the law and the practice is not the overt discrimination, as I said, although that sounds pretty close. Then it means that every case takes a lot of resources because the proof is difficult. And it's very difficult for individual women to take on these cases. We have a culture of rights. We just don't listen to it. Great. Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Elise Schanbacher, and I'm PP2 here at the Kennedy School, and I'm part of a campaign here called the Pipeline Campaign. And we are trying to get gender parity in the faculty here. Our proximate goal is just getting all the centers here to commit to 50% of the speakers that they invite to campus should be women. And we suspect that the problem, as you're saying, it's the pipeline is leaking sooner than by the time we get to this point. But I think we still need to act on the administration here. That's what our pipeline campaign is about. Just because the pipeline is leaking earlier, I don't think that means we shouldn't
Try it.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we keep hearing, and it has to do with the opacity of discrimination, that is a great term, is that we only invite the best in their field. And if the best in their field happen to be men, there's nothing we can do about it. And so how do we send the message that there is this rich vein of talent of women who how do we redefine best, basically? Like, how do we send that message?
I'm not sure you have to redefine best, because by now best is best. By now there are plenty of women in each of these fields. I mean, I can't, it shouldn't be difficult. That was the argument. There were not enough senior women to fill the ranks of the courts. That was the argument 20 years ago. It's just ridiculous now. There are not as many as there should be, yes, but there certainly are women. So I don't want to redefine best. I'm the best. I don't want to redefine it. I don't think you need to do that now. And as I said, I think it is a question of perception. I mean, Mazar Banerjee and another social psychologist who frequently do studies of the following form, where you have, a resume with a male's name and a resume that is essentially equivalent to the female's name, and the perception of the two are totally different, or an African American name is even worse. So the question is, if you offer women who are best in their field, and they are recharacterizing best, gee, this is a women's issue. That was one way that people would be demean. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a women's issue. Don't write about family law. Don't write about this. That would be a different matter. But I'd be astonished if you couldn't get equal numbers.
They still say this. Our group is actually putting out a guidebook to show the centers how to recruit better and be more gender aware and like who they're inviting to speak. But we keep running into that, and we keep running into many of the centers. Only 30% of the people they sponsor to speak on campus are women.
Sponsors to speak, and the faculty.
And the faculty are lower.
Yeah.
20% tenure, I think. 18% tenure, 22% overall.
I mean, there are statistics about the women who are getting PhDs and getting advanced degrees. There are certainly
surpass men in PhDs.
Right. And so it's. I mean, that's a hard nut to crack, because it can't be that women wouldn't want to come and speak, right? I mean, that's not like working 24/7. So it has to be their perception of who is the best.
Right. I guess it was not changing the definition of best then, but like changing their perception.
Right. I represented a woman who was denied tenure a chair, the Henry R. Luce Chair in sociology. This was at Brown. And in the course of pursuing, somebody literally said to me, I just can't see her in the chair. You couldn't see me in this chair. So you were wrong about that, and perhaps you're wrong about her. So I think that that's what's going on. Yes?
Thank you for your experience and really to see talk to one kid. And my question is, how can we encourage and help more women to come to the top and the best on the top?
How do we encourage women to?
We don't have many best women on the top, really. Even still, I'm a researcher and I'm an alumni. And my question is, how can we help more women to be the best on the top?
Well, I mean, I think the leaning out phenomenon that we describe, which is a woman who wants a family, chooses a less challenging career because she wants to give herself the space to be able to have a family. We have to encourage younger women not to do that and recognize that the charge then is to change the institutions that they are not welcoming them. I mean, part of it is, I go to bar association meetings, and there's always the boring discussion about, well, there have to be more mentors. Yes, there have to be more mentors. And, there have to be more programs. Yes, and more recruitment. But I'm really talking about an institutional difference. I'm talking about really saying, try to understand why women are making the choices that they're making, and try to deal directly government or dealing with the institutions that are making it not friendly. I don't know whether the answer to Harvard's not having women faculty and not having women speakers is, I don't think that that's the same answer. As I said, that's a stereotyping issue. But what you're talking about, women in the top in general, I think is an issue of we want to have families and we don't see how that's possible. And as I said, it's not an individual issue. I mean, I was able to do it. I married someone who was a lawyer, and we talk about, you know, he loved what I did as a lawyer, and I loved what he did as a lawyer, the ACLU. I loved what he did. And we organized our lives so that we could each do this. We were both Trekkies. We loved to talk about the enterprise, you know, and so that's what we did, and we're doing that now. But it shouldn't be the happenstance of who you marry and how much money you have. If we care about equality, it has to be something else. Yes.
Quick comment and a question. I worked at one of those law firms that
And
had
survived.
15%. Well, no, not the layoffs, but I actually practiced in front of you. But I thought it was worth noting that many of those women who do make it to the partnership have stay-at-home wives, and at least if they have children. And my question for you is, how do we deal with the perception of the women who do succeed, those 15%? Because my wife just got a tenure-track position at Cornell, which, you know, in philosophy, which has 18% tenured females, and multiple men have come up to her and said, you probably got this position because you're a woman. And I think that's a really common perception, that if women succeed above men, it's because they were given a leg up. How do we combat that?
That's actually amazing to me at this stage. I mean, I don't understand how that could be. You had mentioned that you're doing affirmative action studies, right? About to see what.
Yeah, I'm actually doing something that is relevant for that, namely looking experimentally at how cooperation works within a group when part of the group is there because of affirmative action. And the reason I do this is that I was inspired by the Norwegian board quota, because there it was talk about cooperation problems on boards following the quota, namely then especially the men not wanting to cooperate with the women who are there, perceived then as being there because of the quota. So yeah, it's a little surprising that they actually say it, but that they think it, I don't think it's surprising at all.
Well, I think one of the things to really look at there, whenever you have implicit bias, which is unrecognized by the individual who's in essence perpetrating the bias, when you have explicit bias, just as Judge Gertner talked about how during that time period you understood, I think whenever women encounter explicit bias, what you know is the other narrative has been unmasked. And when it's unmasked, it gives you a direct opportunity to rebuild the narrative and explain, and though offensive in its statement and uncomfortable in its presence, it also is the passive change. So that's the moment where one has to come armed. One should anticipate the implicit as well as explicit bias, and then one can give an alternative narrative. Because in essence, the person says it out loud almost as a question, right? Because they have already been thinking it. Why do they choose to put it forward? One of the answers that I would counsel women on, or anyone encountering this type of bias, is that then you want to retort back. Thank you for sharing what your perspective was. You'll know why I'm here after you've worked with me, and see that I'm here for my competence and expertise. I look forward to working with you. Done. One should also, perhaps over wine later, be conscious of the fact that now you know with whom you are working. You understand that if they carry this bias, they probably carry others.
All sorts of others, right.
And how will you anticipate that? And I think it should be instructive that for everyone who shares the explicit bias, the implicit bias will be present. And that's a roadmap for how you're going to have to build your narrative before you wait for that question, wherever it is that you are. And that's the key. We work on implicit and explicit bias here.
Right. There's another question. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask on a different subject, having been in your courtroom as well in a different role. I'm wondering about women prosecutors. And I'm wondering if there is pressure, implicit or explicit, on women prosecutors not to be empathic in their deal-making with clients. Because I come across many very severe prosecutors.
You're vibrating.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, excuse me.
That's probably one of them right now. In juvenile cases, when I'm trying to come to some kind of, compromise in the cases, and I find that many times the female prosecutors are almost angry at being asked to be empathic or to take the juvenile's situation into consideration.
Good Lord. Well, I mean, I think there's a version of that on the bench, that you had to, there were women, there were sort of deniers and non-deniers. The deniers would say women and men are equally rational, apply the law and nothing but the law. And then there are those of us who said everyone brings their context to the bench. Everyone does. I think that I don't necessarily always see that. I think it really depends on what the office is. Certainly newcomers to the field feel they have to prove themselves. Mm-hmm. But again, that's why this is a topic that I want to delve more into. They're not newcomers in the field anymore. They're not. Mm-hmm. One of the stories that I don't tell is the prosecutors and government lawyers have been fully integrated for the longest time. It's really a private bar situation. So I'm surprised. Part of it is also a young lawyer issue, by the way. Mm-hmm. There's no question, I said this the other night, that young women have a harder time starting than young men. It's almost as if young men can pass and young women can't. They learn to, and they ultimately get the skills that enable them to. But a young woman, raised as we all were, to, not to be aggressive, and that raised the way we still are, have a hard time in court. I would have women law clerks, there'd be a woman law clerk and a male law clerk, and they'd be telling the same, presenting something on a case, and she'll say, I'm not sure, and maybe, and he'll say, this is the law. He's wrong, she's wrong. I mean, there's something in between. But so I think that young women certainly have that issue. But it says, it's almost as if the public is tired of stories of discrimination. I think that's the reason why the law went the way it did. The bench is certainly tired of stories of discrimination, and we have to continue to say them. That's a hard one, because you're, I mean, I'm not sure. I wonder whether the drink is the idea, is to take the prosecutor out for a drink and say, just because the majority of the office is male doesn't mean you can't be empathic. No one regards that as a weakness. Yes.
Hi, my name is Melissa. I'm a first-year MPP. Thank you very much for coming today. I really, really appreciated this talk. I completely agree when you say that women need to hold themselves to a higher standard. I feel like I have a lot of friends that are very ambitious, and they still compromise. So I have friends in medical school right now, and instead of going into surgery, they're going to go into OBG. I have friends that are graduating from law school, and instead of clerking, they're going to work for a firm. And even the big firms versus the smaller firms, like a lot of what you said, I see my friends making these decisions that put them on this different trajectory for the next their life. And then I'm actually working, the last semester I was working with Rosebud Cantor at the business school.
Sure.
And Myra Hart, so I was doing research on sort of almost exactly what you said, how it parallels basically the lack of women in corporate boards. And so it's something like 16% or 17% in the US, it's 9% globally. There's a financial component to this, so there's a positive correlation that if you have women on corporate boards, you actually outperform your peers regardless of industry or sector.
Is that right? That's interesting.
Yeah, and the irony of this is that a lot of businesses know this, like a lot of Fortune 500 companies are like, oh, we acknowledge this, again, they use like a pipeline argument, et cetera, they have mentorship programs. And Catalyst, a lot of the research, and also McKinsey, they do some really good work as well, have found that really one of the key linkages is having this commitment from the CEOs. And the CEO is usually a man, because 97% of Fortune 500 companies are run by men. So they say that you have to have this formal commitment from the CEO to have these women be able to get through the pipeline. The irony is that when you talk to the CEOs, they'll be like, unless you make this explicit commitment, it doesn't necessarily happen. And a lot of it is structural. So it comes back, again, almost exactly to what you're saying with you need to, almost like mandatory paternity leave or on-site daycare or things like this. So my question is more, how do you get men to realize that this is an issue? Because I see it in my generation as well, like men don't necessarily, I mean, they want to have this family balance. And even the friends that I know that are now at HBS that worked at Goldman Sachs and iBanking or TPG for private equity, you know, they're like, you ask them how this works, you know, in the next decade, and they say, if you're a man, even though our company does offer paternity leave and you take it, like you're seen as a wuss. Same as like McKinsey and consulting, and it's kind of across the board. So I guess you want to know how to make this happen. You know, how do you structurally do it, and then how do you also do it from like a legislative perspective?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, it is a public education issue. It is a continuing public education issue, no matter how, no matter how boring it may seem. And in addition, it's a question of the Ben Heinemans of the world, for example, have to talk to the CEOs about the kinds of advantages of maximizing women's participation, and do it from the top. In dealing with young men, I mean, I'm not sure. I have two of my own, I think that that's part of the public education as well. They saw a house that was fully integrated. They saw, a husband who, the only time we fought, and we fought mightily, was in the kitchen. I hated the way he cooked. He hates the way I cook. But the kids saw that kind of work together. And you have to deal with popular culture. Popular culture is very complicated now. I have to admit, I haven't quite wrapped my head around it. It's almost like the sexual revolution, which we touted 20 years ago, has turned in on itself, so that there are images on television and themes that seem to be commodifying women all over again. So, I mean, I think it is education, and it is a government solution to some degree.
We had Jennifer Siebel Newsom here last week or the week before to screen Misrepresentation. So if you haven't heard of it or watched it,
it's what?
Misrepresentation. It's a Sundance documentary, and it's all about the misrepresentation of women in media and how it perpetuates these horrible roles and stereotypes in society.
Yeah,
Great.
and when we started, we were, as I said, we were obnoxious. If someone did something on television, there would be this outcry, and you'd picket, and et cetera. We have stopped doing that. But frankly, I mean, I have to admit, and I'm going to sound ridiculous on this, but the notion, when I saw the Pan Am flight attendants, flight attendants, that was the paradigm of discrimination. Women only could be flight attendants. There was literally an airline company that justified having pretty, thin women in the plane because the plane was like a womb. That was in a case. So, I mean, the notion that we could be, touting this again seemed extraordinary. So it is a public education issue, yeah.
Judge Gertner, I like what you've said about the need for state support for these programs, mandatory paternity leave, these big structural changes. So I have sort of a two-part question, which is, what do you see as any paths forward for those big changes that we think will be successful? And what do you tell those individual women who are leaning out because of a realistic evaluation of their career possibilities?
Well, I'm not sure it's a realistic evaluation of their career possibilities. I think it's the easier way out. It's not entirely clear to me that a young woman who leans in and does well and is valued by the firm will not be able to write her own ticket. She may fear that won't happen, but it's not clear to me to some degree we're talking about elite schools. There's no question about it. I had kids when I was 39, and at that point I could call up the court and say, Stephen has 101, I'd like you to put off this case. And I had enough stature to do it. I don't necessarily recommend that everyone wait to get pregnant until they're 39, but I understood that I needed to be established before this happened. So it's not clear to me that the women who are leaning out have to. That's the first issue. So that there's a much smaller group that doesn't have to do that. I do think that the government solution, while I think it's the right one, it just is not even part of the conversation in the United States now. I think that the way to deal with this is directly to talk to CEOs. You have very talented women that you are basically driving out. The attrition rate in big firms is an inefficient way for any company to work, no matter who. You train these women and then they're gone. you're training men and they're gone too. It's not at the same numbers. And then the profession as a whole have to worry that women are going home. So, I mean, I think at this point it has to be a private corporate solution only because we can't have we can't even talk about government sponsorship, which is too bad. I want someone else to have a turn. Yes.
Let me emphasize that I'm a feminist, and because I have a somewhat sensitive question to ask. 3 months ago, I gave a talk on exploring insights into and impacts of the evolution of women's liberation in America, and I read 16 books on the subject. And my mother, I'm the only child of a single mother, got 3 graduate degrees, worked full-time until she was 76 for 6 major organizations in America, and I had a nanny after I was 3 months old. What's my question? And this is a genuine question. I'm embarrassed I don't know the answer. Is there any medical evidence on how long it's better for a mother to breastfeed her child? And the reason I'm asking is because I wonder if there isn't some pressure to maybe stay at home for a year or something.
Well, I don't know, but maybe you have the answer to the medical evidence. The other controversial thing that I want to say is that I believe that we have done to motherhood what Betty Friedan writes about having been done to the domestic role. In other words, what Betty Friedan writes in The Feminine Mystique was that the mythology was that a woman's the woman will only be satisfied if she's married and at home with a family. I have 2 grandchildren now, and talking with my stepdaughter about how complicated we have made motherhood, how extraordinarily complicated. And I wonder if we're doing the same thing to motherhood as what had been done to the domesticity myths. If you believe that the only way that your child will not be an axe murderer is if you breastfeed until they're, 2, you're going to have trouble. Or if you believe that the only way that they can eat is...
the truth?
I don't know. Do you know the answer?
I do know. I'm Carol Allen. I'm a pediatrician, retired pediatrician. I will say I have some parallel stories to ones that you told when you were graduating from school. I was graduating from medical school. So, but to answer your question, medically, or from the point of view of the mother-child dyad, exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, and breastfeeding, and some breastfeeding up to 1 year of age is what's recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. But let me just say that I don't see that that's not possible. It goes back to the institutions, the employers, and to make it possible for women to do that. They don't have to stay home. They can successfully nurse. I certainly did it, and it's very possible.
How do you do it? You bring the baby to work?
Right.
Or you pump. I mean, it may not be perfect in that regard, but it's good enough.
It's an issue of the breast milk, so you can pump, right.
What's actually interesting is when we look at any of these studies which deal with the issues Judge Gertner has so eloquently framed for us, whether it's looking at the business case and what is the bottom line efficiency for keeping women in the marketplace, which we know we'll need to. If we look at the US and Europe, we have the majority of people graduating from both college and graduate programs such as the Kennedy schools and others are women. Within the next decade, we'll see the same in South America.
Wow.
That's right. Which means over time, our ability to function as a society, which we have in the past, will either mean we will need to change the paradigm of how we go through the pipelines and how women's talent is valued within institutions, or we'll begin a broader gaining of male talent from outside these continents. Wow. And it could go either way. So the issues which Judge Gertner is raising are really right at the pressure points for where feminism is going and what the answers will be. And make no mistake about it, each of these is an opportunity where a challenge is placed, but without intervention, I see no reason that history would not repeat itself.
Right.
Right? 2, interesting to note, when we look at things such as myths, which Judge Gertner talked about having to do.
It's my next career.
One of the things that we see is often because our social myths are so intense, when we read the data, we link things which aren't necessarily linked. What we know is that children do better when they're breastfed. What has never been disaggregated is whether it's the milk or whether it's the content. So what we don't know
That's
is
interesting.
if a child was cuddled and held the same amount even by the male parent, would we have the same outcome? That hasn't been disaggregated and we don't know.
It's what?
Our son and his husband have a little boy, so we have a grandchild who has been mentored by two men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much of what we need to know and understand in order to make these value judgments would require further research and data, which is why we do so much of it here.
Right.
But it's very interesting how we like to link facts because it fits into a social paradigm which perhaps are not linked.
And right, and every year there's always some. I loved it when my kids were both in daycare. I loved it. There was always some article that linked daycare and aggression. I mean, it was, they would alternate. There would be daycare and the kids would be more aggressive, or daycare the kids would be more social, and it went back and forth. And the other thing is about sort of the electronic mom. I love the notion that I have an automatic text message, which I call the Jewish mother text message, which is, I have to describe it as I would say it, which is, I tell my son Peter or my son Stephen, you never call, you never write, and I have it all. I have it in a text message. Or the other thing is that having a cell phone this is one aspect of the 24/7 clock. I was once hiking in Scotland. I had a talk and I went hiking there, and I get a call from my younger son who can't find his soccer shoes. And the sad thing is that I knew just where they were. So, I mean, both kids grew up knowing that wherever I was in the planet, I knew where they were, I knew what their schedule was, and, I would take care of it. So, I mean, I don't know, I worked, but they would have liked me to know less about their lives than I, in fact, did. You had your hand up. Did you have your hand up, or you're playing with your hair? You're playing with your hair, yes.
I want to maybe just add that we should also be careful as we go forward. There was a speaker who did this seminar last year who just offered a word of caution about resting our message of why we need more women in corporate boardrooms on this research, which is pretty new, showing that corporate boards perform better. And there's a linkage that we have that we don't actually know what the true causal relationship is.
Yeah, it's not causal, it's all corollary.
Right,
Well,
so there may be
noted
data
correlates,
coming out, this person, he was a fellow last year, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I forget his name, but said that, maybe there actually is some mixed evidence, I don't remember exactly.
There is, yeah, same with the boards out of Norway.
So, resting the case for more women in the boardroom on, the business case, we should also be thinking about other messages that, other reasons why women in the boardroom are important and how we can, convince people of that in case the data don't go.
So it's a matter of framing. I mean, right? It's just like if it's men who are in charge and you're worried about the bottom line, then you would frame it in that way. Obviously, that's not the reason or the bottom or the final rationale for this.
But it is a question of, I mean, one thing that Ben Heidemann and others talk about is that the diverse world and a global world, people who know how to deal with difference will do better. And that women don't necessarily know about dealing with difference more than men, but they are oftentimes, because of how we were raised, that's exactly what we know how to do. I have an ongoing debate about this notion of whether women judges make a difference, and there's a very interesting discussion. I mean, women, first the women who are becoming judges is a very diverse pool now. So if women of the next generation become judges, they didn't have the same experience as we have. You can't say there's an equal correlation between women and judging and the same perspective. Ruth Ginsburg has a different perspective than I have. But one thing is clear, I think, and I don't want to, essentialize, as they say. I had an appreciation of context. I never saw law as only about the legal rules on the page. I had a sense of context. It was sometimes not determinative, but it would make a difference. I would sit in someone, and I would know where the mother is sitting and where the children are sitting, and I would observe. I just remember this one case that at the time that the man's crimes were about to be described, the mother took the baby out of the room. And I thought, well, that was a good thing to do, and that said something very sensitive about this. So the question is appreciating the context. Certainly there are men who appreciate the context as well, but, and I bring to the table, as I describe in my book, I mean, I was not raised wealthy. So once I was at a judge's discussion, and somebody said, well, the damages in this case were $5,000. That was de minimis, not much. And I said to him, gee, where I came from, that was actually a lot of money. So everybody, the process of judging and exercising judgment and who you believe and who you don't and what you think is reasonable and what you don't is contextual. And women oftentimes bring to the table just a different sense of context. One silly story, I was on the bench for about 2 weeks. Judge Saris and I had both had kids in school. The court meets periodically to talk about, what to do in the event of snow. Before we got on the bench, every judge would determine from his own courtroom, this is a classic, right, what to do when it snowed. And every judge would determine whether to call off court or not, call the jurors and tell them to stay at home or not. And typically what happened is the judge would call his clerk at 4 a.m. and say, you're coming in, and tell everyone they're coming in. Judge Saris and I looked at one another. We both had kids in the schools, and we said, no, the rule is going to be this. If the Boston schools are closed, nobody has to come in. Because I don't know about you, but I'm not coming in while the little guys are at home. So that was going to, and it was amazing to everyone around the table. That's the sense of context. We were juggling, and that was reflected. And so that's the rule. Yes?
It's very, very interesting. How can we bring peace and reconciliation between families, and how can we educate men to respect women and also women to respect men? Again, because if we just antagonize each other, it's going to be very dangerous for our existence for the future. So we need to prescribe, not to just destroy everything. But I wish if the government help us to put the curriculum of education, how to respect each other, how to help each other, and also how teach men how to take care of children.
I think it is. I think it's media. I think we have to talk about the media again. I think that we have to talk about curriculum. I think we have to talk about public speakers. There are things that have happened during the course of this recent presidential campaign that I have, there's another op-ed. It's like the book was written, I might add, from a file I kept called Sexist Tidbits. And as I was going through, going through my legal career, I knew that sometimes I couldn't say to somebody, how dare you say that, because I would be humorless and it wouldn't work, but I would write it down. And the advantage of writing it down was not only that this book came out of it, but as a judge, sometimes I would have someone in front of me, oh yes, I remember you. Yes. Now, that was helpful. It wasn't dispositive, but it was helpful. So it was very good.
Judge Nancy Gertner.
Thank you.